World War I and World War II are often treated as two separate conflicts, but in reality they are deeply connected. Many historians even describe them as part of the same long historical chain, with a short break in between rather than completely independent wars. To understand why World War II happened, you first have to understand how World War I ended, because the end of one war directly created the conditions for the next.
World War I ended in 1918 after 4 years of brutal fighting involving much of Europe and several global powers. The war had caused massive destruction, millions of deaths, and widespread economic collapse. Countries were exhausted, populations were traumatized, and governments were desperate to ensure that such a devastating conflict would never happen again.
When the fighting finally stopped, the world powers gathered to negotiate peace terms, leading to the creation of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. On the surface, the treaty was meant to bring stability and prevent future wars.
However, the way it treated the defeated nations, especially Germany, ended up creating deep resentment and long-term instability instead. Germany, in particular, was forced to accept extremely harsh conditions under the treaty.
One of the most significant was the War Guilt Clause, which stated that Germany was entirely responsible for starting World War I. This single clause became a major source of humiliation for the German people, who felt that the situation was far more complex and that blame was being unfairly assigned. In addition to this, Germany was required to pay massive reparations to the Allied countries.
These payments placed an enormous burden on an already weakened economy, draining resources and contributing to financial collapse. Germany also lost significant portions of its territory, including regions with valuable resources and industrial centers, which further weakened its ability to recover.
On top of all that, the German military was severely restricted. The size of the army was limited, weapons production was controlled, and Germany was forbidden from maintaining many types of modern military equipment.
These combined restrictions created a situation where Germany was not only weakened but also deeply frustrated and humiliated. The economy struggled to recover, inflation increased dramatically, and unemployment became widespread. At one point in the early 1920s, Germany experienced hyperinflation so extreme that money became almost worthless, and people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy basic goods like bread.
This economic chaos had a powerful psychological effect on the population. Many Germans began to lose faith in their government, which was known as the Weimar Republic, and started to believe that the country had been betrayed by both foreign powers and internal political leaders.
This sense of humiliation and instability is extremely important because it created a vacuum in which extremist political movements could grow. When people are desperate and angry, they become more open to radical ideas that promise quick and powerful solutions. In Germany, several political groups competed for influence during this time, but one of the most successful was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party.
This party was led by Adolf Hitler, a World War I veteran who had strong nationalist beliefs and a powerful ability to speak to large crowds.
Hitler and the Nazi Party built their support by promising to restore Germany's strength, fix its economy, and undo the Treaty of Versailles. They argued that Germany had been betrayed and needed strong leadership to rise again. This message resonated deeply with many Germans who were struggling with poverty, unemployment, and national humiliation.
The Nazi Party also used propaganda very effectively, controlling media messages and presenting Hitler as a strong, almost heroic figure who could save the country. Over time, their popularity grew rapidly, especially during the global economic crisis caused by the Great Depression in 1929, which hit Germany particularly hard and made existing problems even worse.
By 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once in power, he quickly moved to eliminate political opposition and transform Germany into a dictatorship. Civil liberties were restricted, Opposing political parties were banned, and the government became fully controlled by the Nazi regime. This marked a major turning point, because Germany was no longer a fragile democracy. It had become a centralized authoritarian state under Hitler's control.
After consolidating power internally, Hitler began focusing on rebuilding Germany's military strength. This directly violated the Treaty of Versailles, but by this point, other European nations were hesitant to respond strongly. Many countries, especially Britain and France, were still recovering from the trauma of World War I and were determined to avoid another large-scale conflict at almost any cost.
This led to a policy known as appeasement, which meant allowing certain actions by aggressive powers in the hope that it would prevent war. Instead of immediately confronting Germany's violations, Britain and France often chose to tolerate them, believing that satisfying some of Hitler's demands might prevent further escalation.
However, Hitler's ambitions did not stop at rebuilding Germany. He believed in expanding German territory and uniting all German-speaking peoples under one empire. He began by remilitarizing Germany, then moved to annex Austria in 1938 in an event known as the Anschluss. Shortly after, he demanded and gained control over the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, claiming it was necessary to protect ethnic Germans living there. Each time, the international response was limited, and each success encouraged Hitler to become more aggressive.
Eventually, it became clear that appeasement was failing. Instead of stopping his expansion, Hitler continued pushing forward. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. This invasion was the final breaking point for Britain and France, who had guaranteed Poland's independence. As a result, both countries declared war on Germany shortly after the invasion, officially marking the beginning of World War II.
Once war began again in Europe, it quickly expanded into a global conflict involving countries across multiple continents, including the United States, the Soviet Union, Japan, and many others. The scale of World War II would ultimately surpass even the devastation of World War I, making it the deadliest conflict in human history.
When looking at both wars together, the connection becomes very clear. World War I did not directly cause World War II in a simple way, but it created the conditions that made it possible. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles created anger and instability in Germany. That instability allowed extremist movements like the Nazis to gain power. Once in power, Hitler's policies and ambitions directly challenged the international order created after World War I.
The failure of European powers to respond effectively during the 1930s allowed those ambitions to grow unchecked until war became unavoidable.
In this sense, World War I and World War II are not just two separate historical events, but part of a continuous chain of cause and effect. World War I ended one global crisis, but the way it was resolved helped create another. Peace that followed World War I was not strong enough to hold, because it left too many nations resentful, too many economies unstable, and too many political systems vulnerable to collapse.
Ultimately, the connection between the two wars teaches an important lesson about history. How a conflict ends can be just as important as how it begins. When peace is built on punishment and instability rather than cooperation and recovery, it may only delay the next conflict rather than prevent it. World War II was not an isolated event. It was the result of unresolved tensions and consequences that began long before the first shots were fired in 1939.